Chapter 35. Javier. Summer of 2016, 8 months after Anya's departure. It had never been Javier's plan to grow close to Anya. She was a vampire, a weapon that he could one day use against the Four Pillars, giving her a roof over her head, providing her with a steady diet, health care, and an education, were just all the things that corresponded to him as his duties as her guardian. After all, how could he really expect her to perform without the bare minimum essentials and knowledge of the world? No, it had never been Javier's plan to have more than a business relationship with her. And yet, the first year that she was in his care had tested this. Those early days had been difficult. She was disoriented, suffering from constant fevers, and cried endlessly. In those premature days, he had told himself that sitting by her bedside, watching as her fever passed, or wiping her tears, were his duties as the girl's guardian. She wouldn't be able to operate if she was sickly and sad. Besides, he did not have a heart made out of stone. He had a son of his own who he loved. How much could it hurt for him to take care of an 8-year-old girl, even if she was a vampire? Apparently, 9 years later, it caused him a lot of harm, because in her absence, he found himself constantly thinking and worrying about her. Was she all right? Was she getting enough to eat? Was she getting everything situated that she needed to? Was she in danger, or heading into it? Is that why she hadn't returned yet? Had something held her up? Was she even still alive? The last one he tried to shut down immediately, but the rest were still questions he asked himself day in and day out. He couldn't even call her to check up on her because her phone had been disconnected, and so as the days passed, all he could do was hope. The only thing that eased his worries was knowing that she was the strongest being that he had ever met. He knew that from the assignments they had been on, but it had been confirmed again when he witnessed her decapitating all those vampires. Anya could not only defeat humans, but she could defeat monsters of her own kind. Though be it the method was a little unsettling. Those obsidian eyes hadn't stopped showing up in his dreams since. It was not as though he was immune to the fear that she provoked in his family, in his son, for he too had been taken aback that night. Although her appearance and her new powers had been disturbing, it was the fear that she was far too gone that gripped Javier. He had always known that he had a very special creature living underneath his roof. His son thought Anya was a curse placed upon Javier for all the evil deeds he had committed, a curse that would eventually lead to his ruin. But Javier didn't see it that way. In fact, Javier thought she was his saving grace, the light in all the darkness that surrounded him, for if it weren't for her, he might have died a long time ago. Javier wondered how long his luck would last, how long he would be able to keep the creature as strong and loyal as Anya at his side. After all, even if she was a half-blood, she had grown up with vampires, and he couldn't help but wonder if part of her wished to return to the wilderness and never look back. Due to this, it was not the fear of death that moved him to action when he saw those obsidian eyes. When he saw the darkness overtake her, it was the overwhelming sensation of curtains being drawn on him, of a good day coming to an end, that if he did not act, if he did not move, if he did not try to pull her out of the oblivion she had fallen into, he would lose Anya forever, and for the first time in a long time, he was scared. In his desperation he had said things that were true, but things he did not ever mean to confess. It had been worth it to see the blackness retreat from her eyes, and when she spoke, telling him to run, he felt the relief of the world off of his shoulders. How ironic that even though he had brought her back from the shadows, he would later find a note taped to his office desk. She had left him anyway, and she did it. Cold stone sober. Javier couldn't even blame her. After all, she never really did belong with him, despite how much he had grown used to her presence. His only problem now was how much he missed her, his little vampire girl. Javier? Javier's gaze landed on Erica, who was a petite older woman in his 60s, who handled the administration at Rancho El Sol, where he was currently waiting to be called upon by the Four Pillars. "See?" he asked. "If you want to give him about 5 more minutes." "Está bien," He nodded. I'm not in any rush. It was true. Those sons of bitches never called on people to tell them what a great job they had been doing. They only ever called on people to discuss assignments, or to bestow punishment, or take lives. There was no in-between. He sighed, wondering what his fate was going to be. He had decided, after Anya left, to take hiatus from field assignments. When the four pillars had asked why, Javier simply stated, I'm in my 50s now. An old man like me needs time to rest. To Javier's great surprise, the four pillars had agreed to give him 6 months at that, and he imagined it was only due to his excellent record which he had achieved thanks to Anya. But now that she was gone, the reality of dying became quite real. It was not that Javier feared death. He knew that, at 50 years old, he was closer to death than ever. He might live maybe another 10 or 20 years, if the good Lord was ever so inclined to even give him that much time. No, death was not what troubled Javier. It was what happened after his death that was the problem. Javier had a feeling that the moment that he breathed his last, his foolish son would somehow try to reform the company. And that was Javier's greatest fear. Ernesto thought that Anya was a monster, but Anya was a butterfly compared to the four pillars, and what they would do to them if Ernesto would ever try to split the ties between the business and them. This was Javier's biggest unrest, and because he hadn't found a solution to this yet, he couldn't afford to die. The problem was that 6 months had come and gone without Anya having returned, and no sign of her coming back any time soon. At this point, the four pillars expected him to resume taking on the assignments, and that is when he found himself taking a calculated risk. He would continue to take the assignments from the four pillars, because he absolutely had no choice in the matter, but he wouldn't do them himself. No, he would outsource them to mercenaries. The issue with this is that no matter how much time Javier spent vetting and threatening the missionaries, the old saying was true. The snake will always bite the hand that feeds it, and of course, one of the mercenaries had stolen a portion of what he had been hired to return. The positive was that Javier's men were efficient. They let him know as soon as they realized. Thus, Javier was able to find the mercenary who dared betray him, kill him, and retrieve the stolen money. The bad part was that this had even occurred in the first place, and he was left wondering if the four pillars had noticed. They are ready for you, Mr. Toro, Erica said, popping out of the corner. Javier let out a breath. Of course they had noticed. They ran the motherfucking country. Javier followed Erica into a meeting room with a long wooden table and brown leather chairs. 4 of the chairs, each occupied by a pillar. Pablo Sanchez, pillar of money. Next to Onario Gonzalez, pillar of assets. Lucia Rodriguez, pillar of power. And finally the 4th pillar, that Javier despised the most. Diego Lopez, pillar of people. Hola, Javier, Lucia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Why don't you take a seat? Javier looked at the big brown leather chair, then back at Lucia's brown eyes. He cleared his throat. I prefer to stand. It's better for my back. Siéntate, Javier, Onario commanded. Not seeing any further reason to fight the inevitable, Javier took a seat on the leather chair, gazing into the eyes of each of the 4 pillars. Mezcal? Lucia asked, as a boy appeared behind her with 5 tequileros and a bottle of mezcal on his tray. It's a 30-year-old añejo. As good as that sounds, Lucia, I think I'll pass. I had a lot to drink last night. Oh, Lucia raised her dark eyebrows. Lots of troubles? Or perhaps regrets? Her eyes twinkled as she said the last word. A man in my profession, I have too many regrets to count, Javier said coolly, not missing a beat. Well, I guess that's true, Lucia said, her smile still plastered on her face. I think I'll have some. Señores? She turned to the table. All 3 men nodded, and soon Javier was the only one who didn't have a tequilero in front of him. Salud, the 4 said, raising their drinks in unison and taking a sip. Well, Javier, do you know why you've been called here today? Lucia asked him. Whatever it is, I can't imagine it's anything good, to be called upon by the 4 rulers of Mexico like this, Javier responded. You stole from us, Pablo Sanchez exclaimed, getting up and pointing a finger at Javier. After everything we've done for you, Pablo spat on the ground. We should kill you. Calma, Pablo, calma, Lucia said, waving at him to sit down, but not removing her eyes from Javier. Recuerda, it was not our friend Javier who stole from us, but others. That he hired, Pablo yelled, still standing. Pablo, Lucia tried again, but was interrupted by Diego. Pablo, cálmate y siéntate. And though Diego's voice was the quietest of the four pillars, it carried the most weight, and Pablo sat down immediately. Diego, who had not stopped looking at Javier with his powder blue eyes, continued in that soft voice of his that gave nothing away. Javier, let's not play games. We have been assigning you assignments, and we expect you to complete them and oversee them personally. But instead, you have been outsourcing them, and as a result, money was stolen. Just before Javier had a chance to defend himself and let the four pillars know that he had recovered the money, Diego continued. If it weren't for the fact that you worked quickly to recover the money and return it to us, you would be dead right now. I'd kill you personally, carajo, Pablo yelled, and then mumbled under his breath, Ingrato. Javier, Diego resumed speaking, I am not going to ask you why you outsourced the assignments, because honestly, it does not matter. Every luxury you have in your life right now was provided by us. Every luxury that your children and their children will enjoy will be continued to be in part thanks to us. When we met you, you were nothing but a dog dying out in the streets, begging us to save your dear little sister. We could have said no. We could have left you both to suffer the fate of the rest of the abandoned children in this country. But we didn't do that, did we? His eyes twinkled dangerously. Instead, we raised you. We taught you. We elevated you from the streets, all the way to the chair that you're sitting in now. But you seem to have forgotten all that, considering that you've been deceiving us. Diego paused, then continued. I believe an apology is in order, do you not? Javier did not allow an ounce of the anger he felt to show in his expression. You're right. I stepped out of line. I offer my sincerest apologies. Diego smiled then. No worries, friend. All is forgiven. Almost. A boy in his young teens came out of the shadows and placed a knife and a chopping block in front of Javier. His spine hardened. Apologies are good and all, Diego said. But a reminder is better, don't you think? He snapped his fingers. Niño, tráele al señor Toro un mezcal. He's gonna need it now, his eyes gleaming with joy. Javier wanted to clench his fist, wanted to punch those disgusting eyes, but years of servitude had taught him he could not allow a single emotion to be expressed. Instead, he took the tequilero that was brought to him. He stood up, looked at Diego's powder-blued eyes. ¿Cuántos? Déjame pensar. Diego smiled devilishly. How many should we collect from Javier? He asked the table. The whole hand! Pablo slammed his fist down on the table. No, he returned the money, Lucia said. If he had stolen it, maybe then we could have called for a harsher sentence. It is his first offense, Diego said. Onadia was the one who ended up delivering the verdict. He likes to smoke, he said. Take his thumb and index finger. Pablo grunted, unsatisfied, but Lucia and Diego nodded. The four pillars turned to Javier expectantly, but he would not perform for them. Instead, he downed his shot glass in one gulp. What a waste, he thought, at not being able to savor the 30-year-old añejo. He placed his thumb and index finger on the chopping block, grabbed the knife, and swung it down with all his might, severing both fingers from his hands. For a moment he felt nothing, and then the pain hit him like 1,000 needles, and he wanted to cry out, but he didn't. There was not much he could control when it came to the four pillars, but his reactions were his own. The boy who had brought him the tequilero was at his side again, giving him a towel. Javier took it, trying to keep his expression emotionless, despite the enormity of the throbbing pain and blood spilling down his arms into his cuffs. If that will be all, he said, using every strength in his body to hide the quiver in his voice. Yes, Diego said, but he was no longer smiling. He had been unsatisfied with Javier's performance. But remember, Javier, disobey us again, and worse things will happen to you, and you'll have wished we would have taken both hands instead. Of course, Javier nodded, and walked off into the distance, hoping to never see all four of these people in the same room again.